One rainy night in Chicago, a pregnant wife sat trapped inside a wrecked car, bleeding, terrified, and begging her husband to save their unborn child. But Dante Moretti, the most feared mafia boss in the city, heard her cry, looked into her eyes, and ran to his mistress first. That single choice shattered a marriage, exposed a deadly family conspiracy, and forced one woman to rise from betrayal with nothing but her dignity, her unborn baby, and the truth. Tonight's story is not just about love, betrayal, or revenge. It is about the moment a woman stops begging to be chosen and starts choosing herself. Welcome to this channel, where we tell stories about mafia bosses, power, loyalty, and the kind of lessons life never teaches in school. This channel does not glorify crime. It reveals mindset, courage, strategy, and the hidden cost of real power. This story reminds us that love without safety is not love, and power without accountability is weakness. If this story pulls you in, comment where you're watching from, share it with someone who loves deep drama, and subscribe for more mafia boss stories.
Rain came down hard over Chicago that night, the kind of rain that turned streetlights into blurred halos and made every passing car look like a ghost moving through smoke. Isabella Moretti sat in the back seat of the black SUV, one hand resting over the curve of her 7-month pregnant belly, the other holding a phone with a message she had typed but not sent. The words glowed on the screen in the darkness. "After tonight, we need to talk." Not as husband and wife, as parents. She had written it 3 times, deleted it twice, and typed it again after leaving the charity gala, where every camera had loved her smile, and every woman in the room had pretended not to notice the way her husband stood too close to Valeria Cross. Isabella had noticed. Of course she had. A wife always notices before the world does. She noticed the way Dante's hand touched Valeria's lower back when he guided her through the crowd. She noticed how Valeria laughed too softly at things that were not funny. She noticed how Dante, the most controlled man in Chicago, looked almost young when Valeria spoke to him, and she noticed the worst part of all: he did not look guilty. Not enough. Not the way a man should look when his pregnant wife was standing 10 feet away, pretending her heart was not breaking under a diamond necklace. Dante Moretti was in the car ahead of her. Even through the rain-smeared windshield, Isabella could see the red glow of his taillights. He always traveled with 3 vehicles when he moved through the city at night. One in front, one carrying him, one behind. That was how men like Dante lived, protected, watched, surrounded. Yet somehow, for all the guards and zungans and careful routes, Isabella had never felt more alone than she did in that back seat, listening to the rain beat against the roof like impatient fingers. The baby shifted inside her, a slow roll beneath her palm. Isabella looked down and softened despite herself. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." She had not decided yet whether the baby was a boy or a girl in her heart. Dante wanted a son, though he never said it directly. Men like Dante rarely had to say what they expected. The whole house arranged itself around their silence. But Isabella had begun to hope for a daughter. A little girl with a stubborn chin and enough courage to never love a man who made her feel small. The convoy turned off Michigan Avenue and headed toward the quieter streets near the river. The gallows was behind them now. So were the cameras, the champagne, the polished lies. Isabella looked again at the unsent message on her phone. Tonight, she told herself. She would send it tonight. She would not yell. She would not beg. She would not mention Valeria first. She would talk about the baby. She would tell Dante that whatever he thought he was doing, whatever weakness he had allowed into their marriage, it had to end before their child was born. She could survive humiliation. Had survived worse things in the Moretti world. But she would not raise a child inside a house where betrayal was treated like weather unpleasant, expected, and never anyone's fault. Then, the first car swerved. It happened so fast that Isabella's mind did not understand it until her body already had. Tires screamed on wet pavement. The SUV lurched sideways. Her driver shouted something she could not make out. A horn blared, long and violent. Through the windshield, Isabella saw headlights appear from the left, too bright, too close, cutting through the rain like a blade. The impact came with a sound that was not one sound, but many metal folding, glass bursting, rubber tearing, a deep, ugly crash that seemed to come from inside her own bones. Her body slammed against the seatbelt. Pain flashed across her shoulder and down the side of her belly. The phone flew from her hand. The world spun. For one impossible second, she saw the city upside down through cracked glass. Then the SUV hit something hard and stopped. Silence followed. Not real silence. There was yid. There was hissing steam. There was someone groaning in the front seat. There was as a distant car alarm screaming again and again, but inside Isabella's head, everything narrowed into one terrifying space. Her hand went to her stomach. "Baby," she breathed. "Baby, please." A cramp tightened low in her abdomen. She gasped and tried to sit forward, but the seatbelt had locked across her chest. The air smelled like gasoline, smoke, and blood. Her door was crushed inward. The window beside her was spiderwebbed with cracks, but through it she could see movement in the rain. Men running, black coats, flashlights, someone shouting Dante's name. Then she saw him. Dante was out of his car, standing in the middle of the wreckage, with rain streaming down his face. In chaos, he looked like himself, tall, controlled, dressed in a black suit now soaked against his body. His eyes searched the scene quickly, sharply, like a man trained to read danger before danger spoke. Isabella hit the window with her palm. Pain shot up her arm. "Dante!" she cried. Her voice cracked, swallowed partly by the rain and the alarm. She hit the glass again. "Dante! Help me!" He turned. Their eyes met through the broken window. For a second, she saw recognition. She saw fear. Not the fear people had of him, but fear inside him, raw and startled. He saw her. She knew he saw her. She pressed her hand harder against her belly and shouted the words that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. "The baby! Dante, please! The baby!" He took one step toward her. Then someone screamed from the other car. "Miss Cross is down! She's not breathing!" Valeria. The name moved through the rain without being spoken by Isabella, but she felt it all the same. She saw Dante turn his head toward the front vehicle, where Valeria's car had been struck near the passenger side. A guard was trying to pull open the door. Another man yelled for a medic. Valeria's pale arm hung limp through shattered glass. Dante stood between the two wrecks. One step toward his wife, 3 steps toward his mistress. Isabella watched him choose. He ran to Valeria. At first, Isabella did not understand what she was seeing. Her mind refused to accept it. Dante was going to check Valeria quickly, then come back. Dante had men everywhere. Dante would send someone. Dante would not leave her trapped here with their child while smoke crawled from the engine and pain tightened around her belly like a fist. But he did not come back. He reached Valeria's car, tore at the door with his own hands, and pulled her from the wreckage. Lifted her against his chest as if she were something precious, something breakable, something that could not be left to anyone else. Isabella stared through the rain as her husband carried another woman toward the first ambulance. Something inside her went very still. Not numb. Not yet. Numbness would have been kinder. This was clarity. Cold, sharp clarity. Marco Bellini reached her SUV moments later with 2 guards. "Mrs. Moretti," he shouted. "Stay with me. We're getting you out." Isabella turned her face toward him, but her eyes kept searching past his shoulder. Dante was still with Valeria. His hand was on her face. He was speaking to her, bending close, rain falling around them like the world itself was trying to wash the scene away. Marco followed her gaze, and for the first time in all the years Isabella had known him, the old soldier looked ashamed. The guards forced the damaged door open enough to reach her. Someone cut the seatbelt. Someone wrapped a coat around her shoulders. When they pulled her out, her knees nearly gave way. Marco caught her before she hit the pavement. "My baby," she whispered. "Marco, something's wrong." His face changed. Ambulance. Now, as they carried her toward the second ambulance, Isabella turned her head one last time. Dante was climbing into the first one beside Valeria. He looked back then, too late. Their eyes met across the rain, across the wreckage, across the few yards that had become wider than any ocean. Isabella did not scream at him. She did not reach for him. She simply held her belly with both hands and let the paramedics take her away. At the hospital, everything became white light, fast voices, cold instruments, and hands moving over her body. A nurse asked how far along she was. Another asked if she could feel the baby moving. A doctor ordered fetal monitoring. Bella tried to answer, but her throat felt full of glass. Outside the emergency room, Dante arrived, soaked, pale, and demanding to see his wife. Dr. Evelyn Hart stepped in front of him before he reached the door. She was not tall, and she was not armed, but she did not move when Dante Moratti stopped inches from her. "I am her husband," he said. Evelyn looked at him once, her expression hard as winter. "Then you should have acted like one at the crash." For once, no one in Dante's world spoke. Hours later, Isabella opened her eyes in a dim hospital room. Her body hurt. Her throat was dry. Her hand moved instantly to her stomach. Dr. Evelyn Hart was beside the bed. "The baby still has a heartbeat," she said. "But your pregnancy is high risk now. We're going to watch you very closely." Isabella closed her eyes as one tear slipped sideways into her hair. Then she saw him through the glass. Dante stood outside the room, one hand pressed against the window, his face stripped of every mask he had ever worn. He looked like a man who had won every war except the one that mattered. Isabella stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned her face away. "Tell him," she whispered. "He already made his choice." Dante Moretti was not used to doors staying closed in his face. In his world, doors opened before he touched the handle. Restaurant owner stepped aside. Detectives lowered their voices. Judges returned phone calls they pretended they never received. Men who hated him still made room when he entered, because hatred was one thing, but survival was another. Yet that night, under the white hospital lights, with rainwater still dripping from the hem of his black coat, Dante stood outside a maternity trauma room and found himself stopped by a woman in blue scrubs who did not care about his name. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood between him and Isabella S. door, like she had been built there. She was not tall. She was not young enough to be intimidated by a hard stare, and not old enough to be impressed by reputation. Her hair was pinned back messily, her sleeves pushed up, and there was a thin line of blood on one cuff that Dante could not stop looking at. Isabella S. blood, maybe. His wife's blood. Thought made something cold move through his chest, but he buried it before it could show. "I need to see her," he said. Evelyn did not move. "No." Dante blinked once slowly. Most people heard that silence and corrected themselves. Evelyn did not. "She is my wife," he said, each word controlled. "She is my patient," Evelyn answered, "and right now my patient does not need the man who added to her distress standing over her bed." Behind Dante, Marco Bellini shifted his weight but said nothing. Two Moretti guards stood near the wall, wet, nervous, and trying very hard not to look at their boss. The hallway smelled like antiseptic, coffee, rain, and panic. Nurses moved quickly past them, pretending not to know who Dante was. Who did know? He saw it in their eyes, the recognition, the fear, the judgment. Judgment was new. Fear he understood. Fear had rules. Fear made people predictable. But judgment sat in the room like smoke. It touched everything. It made even the silence accuse him. "She's in the crash," Dante said. "I need to know if she's all right." Evelyn S. face did not soften. "You will be updated when there is something to update, and only within the limits of what Mrs. Moretti allows." Dante's jaw tightened. "She is carrying my child." "Yes," Evelyn said. "That is why I am telling you to step back." For a moment no one moved. Dante could hear the hum of hospital machines behind the closed door. Somewhere inside that room, Isabella was lying in a bed, hurt, frightened, and carrying the daughter or son he had once promised to protect. He remembered her voice through the rain. Not the first time she called his name. The second time. The one that had cracked open at the end. "Baby! Dante, please! The baby!" He had heard her. God help him, he had heard her. "I want the chief of medicine," Dante said. "You can want whoever you like," Evelyn replied. "But until Isabella Moretti says otherwise, you do not enter that room." Dante took one step forward. Marco's hand came down lightly on his arm. Lightly, but it stopped him. "Boss," Marco said under his breath. That one word usually reminded men who they were. Tonight, it did something else. Dante looked at Marco and saw not loyalty, not readiness, not obedience. He saw disappointment. Quiet, heavy, worse than anger. Dante stepped back. Evelyn watched him for another second, then turned and went into Isabella's room, closing the door behind her with a final unforgiving click. Inside the room, Isabella was awake. Not fully. Pain came and went in waves, and the medication made the edges of the world soft, but her mind remained clear enough to understand what had happened. She lay on her side because that was what the nurses had told her was best for the baby. A fetal monitor circled her belly, and every few seconds, the machine gave a soft, steady sound that had become the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The baby's heartbeat, fast. Jewel. There. Isabella stared at the monitor and counted beats when she felt afraid. 2, 3, 4. Still here. Still fighting. Still with her. Evelyn came back in and removed her gloves. He's outside. Isabella did not ask who. She did not need to. I don't want him in here, she said. Her voice was hoarse. No. Evelyn came closer, and he is not coming in unless you ask for him. Isabella looked at her then, really looked. Can I do that? Evelyn's expression changed, not into pity, but into something steadier. Respect, maybe, yes. You can do that. He is my husband. You are my patient. The answer was so simple that Isabella almost cried, not because it was kind, though it was, but because for years, every answer in her life had been complicated by Dante. Dante's reputation, Dante's enemies, Dante's rules. Dante's family. Dante's idea of what was safe, what was necessary, what Isabella did or did not need to know. She had become used to people looking past her to him, even when the question was about her body, her schedule, her house, her child. Now a doctor stood beside her bed and said, without hesitation, that Isabella's consent mattered. It nearly broke her. What about the baby? Isabella asked. The heartbeat is stable right now, Evelyn said carefully. But the trauma and stress put you at risk for premature labor. We re-monitoring contractions. You had some abdominal pain, which concerns me. We need rest, quiet, and no more emotional shocks tonight. Isabella let out a humorless breath. That may be difficult. I'm not asking your life to become peaceful by morning, Evelyn said. I'm saying your day is already carrying more than it should. You need to start choosing what is allowed near you. Isabella closed her eyes, choosing. That word cut deeper than Evelyn knew. Dante had chosen tonight. Not in a business meeting, not in a bedroom, not in some private betrayal she could pretend not to see. He had chosen in the rain, in front of broken glass and burning metal, while she called for him with his child inside her. And once a woman saw that clearly, she could not unsee it. Can he see my medical records? Isabella asked. No, not without your permission. Can he make decisions for me if something happens? If you are conscious and able to decide, no. If you want someone else listed for emergency medical decisions, we can arrange that. My brother, Isabella whispered. Gabriel Romano, Evelyn nodded. We'll document it. Can I leave the hospital without returning to the Moretti house? Yes. When it's medically safe to discharge you, you can go wherever you choose. Isabella opened her eyes. The heartbeat on the monitor had continued, fast, brave, small. She placed her hand over the curve of her belly. Then I need a phone. Evelyn studied her for a second. For Dante? No, Isabella said, for my lawyer. Out in the hallway, Dante stood with both hands in his coat pockets because he did not trust them outside. He wanted to break something. He wanted to call someone. He wanted a name, an enemy, a target, anything that would make this feeling easier to understand. But there was no enemy in front of him, only a closed door. Only the memory of Isabella's face through cracked glass. Marco stood beside him in silence for several minutes before speaking. You need to hear it from me, he said. Dante did not look at him. Not now. Yes, now. The guards stiffened. No one spoke to Dante like that unless they had earned the right or lost the will to live. Marco had earned it over 30 years of service, and tonight he sounded like a man who no longer cared what it cost. Dante turned his head, careful. Marco's eyes were dark and tired. I was careful when I pulled your pregnant wife out of a crushed SUV while you were climbing into another ambulance with your mistress. The words landed like a slap. Dante's face hardened. Valeria was unconscious. Isabella was trapped. She was awake. She was begging. Dante looked away first. Marco stepped closer, lowering his voice so the guards would not hear every word. I saw it. The men saw it. The paramedics saw it. She called your name, Dante. She called for you and the baby. I looked at her. Then you ran the other way. A muscle moved in Dante's jaw. I made a decision in a crash scene. Valeria wasn't breathing, and Isabella was strong enough to wait? Marco asked. Dante said nothing. Marco's voice dropped even lower. That is, the linemen like us tell ourselves about strong women. We see them standing too many times, so when they fall, we assume they can get up alone. Dante turned on him then, eyes sharp. You think I don't know what happened? No, Marco said. I think you know exactly what happened. I think that's why you're still standing in this hallway instead of tearing this hospital apart. For 1 second, Dante looked like he might hit him. Not because Marco was wrong. He was not. Then a nurse appeared at the far end of the hall and asked for a family member of Valeria Cross. Dante's head turned. Marco saw it, the reflex, the pull. It was slight, but it was there. Something like disgust crossed Marco's face. He did not hide it. Dante walked toward Valeria's room anyway. Valeria had been placed in a private room on another floor, away from the emergency department and away from Isabella. Dante had ordered protection for her without thinking, the way he ordered cars, doctors, silence. Lay propped against white pillows, her red hair damp at the edges, a bruise darkening along her cheekbone. She looked smaller than she usually did beneath stage lights, younger, more breakable. When Dante entered, her eyes filled with tears. Dante, she whispered. He stopped beside the bed. You reawake. I was so scared. Her hand moved over the sheet, searching for his. I thought I lost everything. You re-safe. Her fingers closed around his. The baby? Dante went still. Valeria's eyes searched his face, as if measuring the effect of each word. They said I need more tests, but there was no major bleeding. Dante, I was so afraid. I kept thinking, what if something happened to our baby? Our baby. The room seemed to narrow. Dante did not pull his hand away, but he did not squeeze hers either. He stared at her, trying to place the words inside reality. Valeria had hinted before, once, maybe twice. A missed cycle, a dizzy spell. He had refused to let the conversation become real because real things required decisions, and decisions left records inside a man's life. Now the words sat between them. Baby. Across the hospital, his wife was lying in another room, carrying the child the world already knew was his. And here was Valeria, bruised and shaking, offering him another truth or another trap. He could not tell which. You should rest, he said. A flicker of something passed across Valeria's face. Disappointment, perhaps. Or calculation. Then she nodded and let her eyes close, still holding his hand. Dante stayed for less than 2 minutes. When he returned to the hallway outside Isabella's room, Evelyn was waiting with a clipboard. Mrs. Reddy has updated her visitor permissions, she said. Dante looked at the paper, though he did not need to. He already knew. She does want to see me. No, for how long? That is up to her. Dante let out a slow breath. And the baby? Stable for now. Still at risk. Stress is not good for either of them. He heard the accusation even though she did not say it directly. Before he could answer, a man in a dark overcoat stepped out of the elevator. Gabriel Romano had Isabella's eyes, but not her softness. He crossed the hall with the controlled fury of a man who wanted to start a war and had not yet decided whether the hospital was too secret a place for it. Dante turned to face him. Gabriel stopped a few feet away. It's my sister. Resting, Evelyn said before Dante could speak. And she asked for you. Gabriel's eyes did not leave Dante. Of course she did. Dante's voice dropped. This is not the place. Gabriel laughed once without humor. That's funny, because the side of the road apparently wasn't the place either. Marco stepped between them and before the air could ignite. Not here, Marco said. Gabriel looked at him, then at the closed door. For Isabella's sake, he swallowed whatever else he wanted to say. I want all medical authority transferred to me if she can speak for herself, he told Evelyn. She already requested that, Evelyn said. Something in Gabriel's expression cracked. It slipped through before anger covered it again. Good. Inside the room, Isabella signed the forms with a hand that trembled only once. She hated that it trembled. Her lawyer, Patricia Wells, had joined by phone first and then arrived in person within 40 minutes, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed like a woman who had ended men's careers before breakfast. Patricia stood beside the bed, reading the notes aloud. You want separate medical authority, preservation requests for all traffic and hospital footage, a written restriction against Valeria Cross entering any jointly owned marital property, and immediate separation of your personal accounts from Moretti-controlled financial management. Yes, Isabella said. Patricia paused. Isabella, you understand what this means? It means I am awake. It may trigger a response from Dante S. side. Isabella looked at her. Dante S. side? Patricia did not answer. Isabella S. voice became quieter. That S the problem, isn't it? Everyone keeps forgetting I was supposed to be his side. Gabriel, standing near the window, closed his eyes. Patricia softened, but only slightly. Could create tension between the families. Isabella looked down at her belly. The baby shifted, faint but real. A tiny answer from within. For the first time that night, Isabella smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was something harder. I am not starting a war, she said. I am ending the part of my life where peace means I stay quiet. Patricia nodded once. Then we begin tonight. Outside, Dante watched Gabriel enter Isabella's room and felt something ugly twist in his chest. Jealousy was too small a word for it. Rage was not accurate either. It was something worse. Recognition that another man, even her brother, had been invited into a place he had lost the right to enter. He had thought marriage made him permanent. He had thought fatherhood made him necessary. Tonight, Isabella was teaching him that a man could be both husband and father and still be kept outside the door if he became unsafe. His phone buzzed. A message from Fuzz Amen. Media caught wind of the crash. We recontaining it. Another message followed. Valeria S. name may leak. Then a third. Romano family attorney has arrived. Dante stared at the screen, and for the first time in years, every solution he knew felt wrong. Silence the media. Pressure the hospital. Control the narrative. Move Valeria. Move Isabella. Pay someone. Threaten someone. Make everything neat before morning. But nothing about Isabella's face through the glass had been neat. Marco came to stand beside him again. What are you going to do? Dante's voice was low. Protect them. Marco shook his head. No. That S, what you will call it. Asking what you were going to do. Dante looked at him. Marco did not back down. Because if protection means control, she'll never trust you again. Before Dante could answer, the door to Isabella's room opened. Patricia Wells stepped out first, followed by Gabriel. Evelyn remained inside. Patricia approached Dante with professional calm. Mr. Moretti. Dante looked at her like he wanted to erase her from the hallway. Counselor. Mrs. Moretti has requested that all communication regarding her medical care and immediate personal arrangements go through my office or Mr. Romano until further notice. Dante's eyes darkened. My wife can speak to me herself. She can, Patricia said. Has chosen not to. The hallway went silent again. Gabriel smiled faintly, but there was no satisfaction in it, only pain. Dante stepped closer to Patricia. Be careful how far you push this. Patricia did not blink. Be careful assuming this is still something you can push. For a moment Dante saw it clearly, not as a boss, not as a Moretti, as a man. Isabella was not asking him to come get her. She was building a wall, brick by brick, while lying in a hospital bed, with his child still fighting inside her, and he had handed her the first stone. Inside the room, Isabella finally held her phone again. There were dozens of missed messages, but one new text appeared at the top from an unknown number. She opened it. I'm sorry about the crash. Dante was just scared for our baby. No name. It did not need one. Valeria. Isabella read the message once, then again. Her face did not change. Gabriel saw it and moved toward her. What is it? Isabella lifted one finger, asking him to wait. Her breathing stayed even. The baby's heartbeat continued on the monitor, fast and steady, filling the quiet room like a small drum. A different woman might have thrown the phone. A younger Isabella might have cried. The Isabella from a year ago might have demanded Dante explain. The Isabella from before the crash might have felt the hot, humiliating need to prove that she was the wife, that she was carrying the legitimate child, that she was the woman who mattered. But the woman in that hospital bed had been left in the rain. And some things burned away in a woman after that. Isabella took a screenshot. Then she created a new folder on her phone. The title was simple, My Child. She saved the message there, locked the screen, and placed the phone on the blanket beside her. Gabriel stared at her, waiting for the collapse. It did not come. Isabella leaned back against the pillow and placed both hands over her belly. Get some rest, Gabriel said softly. She looked at the closed door. Beyond it, somewhere in the hallway, Dante was still standing in the wreckage of a choice he could not undo. I will, Isabella said. But her eyes were open, clear, awake. For the first time since becoming Mrs. Dante Camoretti, she was no longer waiting for her husband to choose her. She had chosen herself. By morning, the rain had stopped, but Chicago still looked bruised. Gray clouds hung low between the glass towers downtown, and the streets shone with leftover water, oil, and the kind of silence that followed bad news. Inside the hospital, people whispered in corners. Nurses who had worked the overnight shift told the morning staff what had happened in careful voices, lowering their eyes whenever Dante Moretti passed. No one said the full story out loud where he could hear it. They did not have to. The facts moved through the building faster than any official report. There had been a crash. His pregnant wife had been trapped. Mistress had been in another car, and the first EMS ambulance had carried the mistress away while Mrs. Moretti was still bleeding in the rain. Dante knew they were talking. He could feel it in the way conversations died when he turned a corner. Usually, that silence belonged to him. Usually, silence was proof of his power. That morning, it felt different. It felt like a verdict. Valeria Cross was discharged as Archson, not because she was fully well, but because Dante did not want her in the same building as Isabella anymore. He told himself it was practical. The media had started circling. Hospital staff had already seen too much. Isabella had refused to see him, and Valeria's presence would only make everything worse. So he arranged a private doctor, a nurse, 2 guards, and a car with tinted windows. He signed papers without reading them and gave orders without looking at Valeria for too long. Valeria, however, looked at him the entire time. She sat in the wheelchair with a wool coat draped over her shoulders, her copper-red hair falling loosely around her bruised face. Even pale and shaken, she knew how to appear delicate in a way that invited protection. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach, not dramatic enough to seem false, but visible enough that Dante could not ignore it. When the nurse stepped away, Valeria reached for his wrist. You re-sending me away. Dante looked down at her hand. I'm keeping you safe. That's what men say when they don't want to explain themselves. His eyes lifted. For a second, the old Dante surfaced, cold and warning. Valeria saw it, but she did not let go. I almost died last night, she whispered, and so did the baby. The words hung there, the baby. Dante hated how easily they changed the air. He had spent his life making sure words did not control him. Men begged in front of him. Men threatened him. Men lied, cried, confessed, and promised. He had learned early that words were tools, not truth. But those 2 words, spoken in Valeria's soft, frightened voice, unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. I have a doctor coming to the apartment, he said. Valeria's mouth tightened slightly. Your apartment? One of them. Her eyes searched his face. Not your house. Dante did not answer. That answer was enough. The apartment stood on the 42nd floor of a private building near the river, a place Dante used for business guests. Visiting attorneys and men who were safer kept close, but not close enough to enter the Moretti estate. Valeria had been there twice before, always at night, always with champagne waiting, always with the city glittering beneath them like a secret they shared. In daylight, it felt different, more expensive, more impersonal. Less like a lover's refuge and more like a beautiful room where someone could be hidden. The elevator opened directly into a marble foyer. Gold light warmed the walls. White piano stood near the windows, untouched and perfectly polished. The living room looked down over Chicago, over the river and the traffic and the tiny people moving below, as if their lives were not already caught in the hands of men above them. Valeria stepped inside slowly, one palm still on her belly. The guards remained by the elevator. Dante's private nurse went to prepare the guest room. A tray of tea, fruit, and bottled water had already been placed on the glass coffee table. Everything was ready. Too ready. Valeria turned to Dante. Is this where you put things you don't want your wife to see? The question landed, but Dante did not react. Rest. She gave a small laugh. That's all? Rest? You were in a crash. So was she. His eyes sharpened. Valeria saw that she had cut too close. For the first time since the accident, she looked away first. Dante moved toward the elevator. The doctor will check on you every 6 hours. If you need anything, tell Michael. Will you come back? He paused but did not turn. Yes. When? When I can. The elevator doors closed behind him, leaving Valeria alone in the golden room. For several minutes she stood still. Then her softness fell away like a shawl slipping from her shoulders. She walked to the window, stared down at the city, and let out a breath she had been holding since the hospital. Her hand slid from her belly to her side. Her face changed. Not completely. It was still there, so was pain. But beneath both was something harder. She had not won. Not yet. Dante had saved her first. That should have meant everything. But men like Dante Moretti did not belong to the woman they carried out of wreckage. They belonged to blood, legacy, law, and the woman whose ring they had put on in front of God and enemies. Valeria had been desired. She had been protected. She had even been chosen in one terrible moment. She had not been made permanent. Not yet. The private elevator opened again less than 20 minutes later. Luca Moretti walked in without being announced. He wore a charcoal overcoat and leather gloves, his dark blonde hair still damp from the weather. Luca had always been handsome in a more approachable way than Dante. Where Dante made people straighten their backs, Luca made them relax. He smiled easily. He remembered birthdays. He poured drinks himself. He laughed before striking. That was why fools trusted him. Aria turned from the window. You shouldn't be here. Luca removed his gloves, finger by finger.
And you should have texted Isabella.
Her face went still. He smiled. Dante looked surprised. You re not careful when you re emotional. I was scared. You were messy. I almost died last night. No, Luca said gently, as if correcting a child. You almost became useful too early. There is a difference. Valeria swallowed. The warmth in the apartment seemed to vanish. Luca walked past her and poured himself sparkling water from a bottle on the tray. He did not ask if she wanted any. Tell me exactly what Dante said. He sent me here. Brought a doctor. He put guards downstairs. That's not what I asked. Valeria's jaw tightened. He didn't deny the baby. Luca turned. For the first time, his smile became real. Good. He didn't confirm it either. He will. You don't know that. Luca came closer. I know my cousin. Dante wants to believe he is still in control. A baby gives him a reason to keep you close without admitting what he wants. And after last night, guilt will do the rest. Valeria wrapped her arms around herself. Isabella isn't weak. No, Luca said. That's why she had to be broken publicly. Valeria stared at him. You said the crash was only supposed to scare her. And it did. She could have lost the baby. Luca's eyes stayed mild. Would have simplified things. The words were quiet, almost polite. That made them worse. Valeria stepped back from him. You never said that. You never asked. For a moment, she looked very young, younger than 28. Younger than the woman who had sung beneath blue lights and let Dante Moretti watch her like she was the only soft thing left in his world. Luca, if Dante finds out he won tea, not unless you fall apart. She saw me. She knows. Isabella knows pain. She doesn't know proof. Valeria looked away toward the piano. Her reflection in its polished surface looked pale and distorted. Baby? Luca's expression changed just slightly. Our baby is the point. She flinched at the word our. There had been a time when hearing it from him made her feel chosen. Now it sounded like a chain. Luca set his glass down. Listen to me. Dante's legitimate child is a threat to everyone who wants this family to change. If Isabella gives him a healthy heir, the old men will tighten around him. The Romano alliance stays intact. Dante remains untouchable. But if her child is gone, and your child is accepted as his, he let the rest sit unspoken. Valeria whispered. Then you have a way in. Then we have a way in. She looked at him. Make it sound romantic. Luca laughed softly. Nothing about power is romantic. Across the city, Dante returned to the Moretti estate alone. The mansion sat behind iron gates and winter-bare trees. Its soon face cold beneath the afternoon sky. The staff moved carefully when he entered. They knew not to speak unless spoken to. They had already heard enough to understand that the house had shifted overnight. Dante went straight to Isabella's rooms. He had not stepped inside them alone in months. Not because he was unwelcome, exactly, but because their marriage had become a place of careful arrangements. They met at dinners, charity events, Family functions, doctor appointments, and sometimes in bed, when silence felt easier than honesty. But Isabella's room remained hers. It smelled faintly of lavender and the cream she used at night. A book lay open on the chair near the window. A pair of soft shoes sat beside the bed. On the vanity beneath the mirror rested her wedding ring. Dante stopped when he saw it. It was not dramatic. No note, no broken frame, no torn photograph. Just the ring, placed neatly in the center of the vanity, as if Isabella had removed it with steady hands. That hurt more than if she had thrown it at him. He picked it up. The diamond caught the pale daylight. He remembered putting it on her finger 4 years earlier in a cathedral filled with roses, soldiers, cousins, priests, and enemies pretending to bless what they feared. Isabella had looked at him that day with clear eyes. Not innocent. She had never been innocent, but hopeful. She had believed there was a man beneath the Moretti name who could still choose love over legacy. Last night, he had proved her wrong in front of God and rain and broken glass. His phone rang. Marco, Dante answered. Tell me. The traffic camera at the intersection went dark 4 minutes before impact, Marco said. Dante's grip tightened around the ring. Function? No. Disabled. By who? Still tracing. But the truck belongs to Holloway Transport. I don't know them. You know who they invoice. Silence, Marco continued. One of Lucas Construction's subsidiaries. Dante looked up into the mirror and saw himself standing in his wife's room, holding the ring she had left behind. His face looked calm. That almost disgusted him. Are you certain? He asked. Not enough for a courtroom. Enough for me. Dante closed his fist around Isabella's ring. Keep digging. There's more, Marco said. What? One of the guards from Valeria's car changed his statement this morning. Says he didn't hear Mrs. Eddie calling for help. Dante's voice went flat. He heard her. Yes, Marco said. We all did. That sentence moved through Dante like a blade. We all did. When night fell, Dante returned to the hospital. Not with guards crowding the hallway this time. Only Marco came with him, and even Marco stayed back when Dante approached Isabella's door. Dr. Evelyn Hart stepped out before he knocked. She's awake, Evelyn said. I need 5 minutes. She does to need stress. I'm not here to argue. Evelyn studied him. That would be a first. Dante accepted the insult because he deserved it. Evelyn went inside. A minute passed. Then 2. When she returned, she opened the door wider. 5 minutes, she said. If her blood pressure rises, you leave. Dante entered. Isabella lay propped against pillows, pale but composed. The fetal monitor still circled her belly. A thin bruise marked her temple. Her hair was loose over one shoulder, and the sight of her like that wounded, quiet, watching him, without reaching for him, struck him harder than any accusation could have. He closed the door gently behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dante said, I made a mistake. Isabella's eyes did not change. No, she said, a mistake is missing a turn, forgetting a date, saying the wrong thing because you retired. He looked down. You heard me, she continued. You saw me. I called your name and told you our baby needed help. Then you ran to her. His throat tightened. Valeria was unconscious, and I was trapped. I thought I know what you thought. Her voice was soft, which made it worse. You thought I was strong enough to wait. Dante said nothing. Isabella placed one hand over her stomach. That's what men always do to strong women. You admire our strength until it becomes an excuse to abandon us. He looked at her then, and she saw pain in his face. Real pain, maybe even regret. Once, that would have mattered enough to soften her. Tonight, it only made her tired. I didn't need you to explain why you chose her, Isabella said. I need you to understand that our child was left behind with me. Dante took one step closer, then stopped when she looked at him. Not afraid, just clear. I will find out what happened, he said. The crash was in random. I know. He paused. You know. Enough to stop believing your version will be the only version. The words cut through him. Before he could answer, Evelyn opened the door. That's enough. Dante did not argue. He looked at Isabella one last time, but she had already turned her face toward the monitor, listening to the baby's heartbeat instead of his apology. When he left, the hallway seemed longer than before. Inside the room, Isabella waited until the door closed. Then she opened the drawer beside her bed and removed the unmarked envelope Gabriel had brought earlier that evening, after it had been delivered to the safe contact address only 3 people knew. Inside was a photograph. Valeria Cross and Luca Moretti, standing in a private elevator, his hand at her waist, her mouth on his. Isabella stared at it for a long time, not because it hurt more than what Dante had done. Nothing could hurt more than the rain. Because this changed the shape of the wound, this was not just betrayal, this was design. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in black ink, someone had written one sentence. The baby she carries is not Dante S. Isabella placed the photo on the blanket over her belly and rested her hand beside it. The monitor kept beating. Fast. Steady. Alive. And for the first time since the crash, Isabella understood that someone had not simply tried to take her husband, someone had tried to erase her child. Isabella did not show Dante the photograph. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not even when Gabriel stood beside her hospital bed, anger burning through him so clearly that every nurse who entered the room could feel it. He wanted to take the photo straight to Dante and force him to look at it. He wanted to drag Valeria Cross out of whatever golden cage Dante had placed her in and make her confess. He wanted Luca Moretti's name spoken out loud, in a room full of witnesses, where no one could pretend this was only a marital scandal anymore. But Isabella stopped him with one hand raised from the blanket. "No," she said. Gabriel stared at her. "No? No!" Isabella repeated, her voice weak but steady. Yet. He looked at the photograph lying on the tray table. Valeria and Luca in the elevator, his hand at her waist, her mouth on his. The sentence written on the back like a knife. The baby she carries is not Dante S. Gabriel's jaw flexed. "Bella, this is enough. It's enough to make people whisper," she said. "It's not enough to survive what they'll do next." Gabriel went still. He had forgotten for one angry moment that his sister understood this world as well as he did. Maybe better. Men like Gabriel were raised to think danger came with a gun, a threat, a betrayal at a table where everyone smiled too politely. Isabella had learned another kind of danger. The kind that came wrapped in sympathy. The kind that called a woman unstable before it called her truthful. The kind that could turn a pregnant wife into a jealous villain if the right men paid the right people to tell the story that way. She looked at the photograph again. One picture can be denied. One anonymous message can be dismissed. One frightened woman can be silenced. I need a pattern. Gabriel sat down beside her bed, the fight draining from his shoulders. Then let me take you out of Chicago. No, Bella, no, she said again. And this time her voice had iron under it. If I run, they'll write the story for me. They'll say I was jealous. They'll say I caused the crash. They'll say I endangered my own child because I couldn't handle Dante choosing someone else. Gabriel's face tightened at the word choosing. Isabella placed both hands over her stomach. The baby had been quiet that morning, which frightened her more than she wanted to admit. The doctors said there were still signs of stability, but stability was not peace. Stability was a thin rope over a dark place. I want to let my child be born into a lie, someone else wrote. Across the city, in the Moretti estate, lies were already being arranged like furniture before a party. Dante sat at the head of the long dining room table, though no food had been served. Around him stood men who had spent their lives pretending they were not afraid of anything. Older cousins, business partners, two family attorneys, a retired judge who owed the Morettis enough favors to keep his mouth shut until death. He sat halfway down the table, calm as a priest, one ankle crossed over his knee. The room smelled of coffee, leather, and old power. Dante had not slept. There was a shadow under his eyes, but his suit was perfect, his hair combed back, his face unreadable. On the table in front of him were two reports, one from the hospital, one from Marco's first investigation into the crash. Luca was the first to speak gently, which made Marco hate him more. "This can still be contained," Luca said. "The press knows there was a crash. They don't know details. If we move carefully, the family avoids public damage." Dante looked at him, the family. Luca spread his hands. "That is what we are protecting, isn't it?" Marco stood near the window, arms crossed. Watched Luca since the meeting began. Too calm, too clean, too ready with the correct amount of concern. A man truly shocked by a family tragedy did not speak in polished sentences before noon. One of the older men cleared his throat. "There is also the matter of Miss Cross." Dante's eyes went cold. "What matter?" The old man hesitated. If she is carrying your child, the situation becomes complicated. No, Marco said before he could stop himself. What became complicated was leaving his wife in a wrecked car. The room froze. Dante did not move, but the silence around him sharpened. Luca lowered his eyes, hiding the smallest smile. The old man looked offended. This is not the time for emotion. It should have been the time for emotion last night, Marco said. Maybe then Mrs. Moretti wouldn't be lying in a hospital bed, wondering if her baby will survive. Dante's hand tightened around the arm of his chair. Enough. Marco stopped, but not because he was wrong, because Isabella's mattered more than his anger. Luca leaned forward, his voice soft. Dante, no one is blaming Isabella. She's pregnant, injured, emotional. But Gabriel Romano is already circling. If he convinces her to turn this into a public accusation, we have a problem. Dante stared at him. What kind of accusation? That you failed her. Luca paused carefully. Valeria matters more. That perhaps Isabella was upset before the crash. Distracted. Driving too close, angry. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Marco turned his head slowly. Say that again. Luca looked at him with mild surprise. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm saying the media might. Dante stood. Every man in the room rose with him, except Luca, who stood a half-second later. My wife did not cause that crash, Dante said. No one said she did, Luca replied. Almost did. Luca bowed his head just enough to look respectful. Then let us make sure no one else does. By late afternoon, Isabella was discharged from the hospital under strict instructions. Rest, monitoring, no stress. Follow-up appointments. Immediate return if pain, bleeding, dizziness, or reduced fetal movement occurred. Evelyn explained everything slowly, looking directly at Isabella rather than Gabriel, rather than Patricia Wells, rather than any man standing nearby. You are not fragile, Evelyn told her before she left, but you are not invincible either. Do not let anyone confuse the two. Isabella carried those words with her. She did not go back to Dante's mansion. Instead, Gabriel drove her to a quiet brick house on a tree-lined street outside the busiest part of the city. It belonged to a women's supports foundation. Isabella had funded anonymously for 2 years. There were no marble floors, no armed men in hallways, no portraits of dead Morettis looking down from the walls. The furniture was simple, the locks were new. The bedroom had pale curtains and a quilt folded at the foot of the bed. For the first time in years, Isabella stepped into a house Dante did not own. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, one hand on the frame. Gabriel watched her. It isn't much. Isabella breathed in the quiet. It's mine tonight. That evening, Dante came. No full convoy. Dramatic entrance. Just one black car at the curb and Marco behind the wheel. Isabella watched from the living room window as Dante stepped out. No flowers, no gifts, no apology large enough to be insulting. He looked up and saw her. For a moment, neither moved. Gabriel opened the door but did not invite him in. Dante looked past him. I need to speak with my wife. Isabella came to the doorway herself. She wore a loose gray sweater, her hair tied back, her face pale but calm. 5 minutes outside. Gabriel started to object, but she touched his arm. I'll be all right. They stood in the small backyard beneath the sky that still threatened rain. Tate looked around at the plain fence, the narrow garden, the porch light flickering above them. He seemed almost offended by the simplicity of it, as if safety should look more expensive. You should come home, he said. Isabella gave a tired smile. Home? He flinched before he could hide it. Home is where a woman is saved when she is bleeding, she said. I was not home that night. Daunt looked down. Rainwater from the gutter dripped steadily near his shoes. The crash wasn't random. I am looking into it, so am I, his eyes lifted. You need protection. I need independence. You need both. No, she said. I needed both before the crash. I need one before I can trust the other. Dant's face tightened, but he did not argue. Isabella took a slow breath. If you want any place in this child's life, there will be conditions, my child, he said quietly. Our child, she corrected. The child you ran away from, the words landed. Daunt absorbed them without defense. I want an independent investigation into the crash, she said. Not Moretti men, not Romano men, real investigators. I want all traffic footage preserved. I want medical decisions to remain mine. I want a DNA test when Valeria's baby is born. And I want your relationship with her ended publicly before the family council. Dante stared at her. You want to humiliate me? No, Isabella said. I want to teach our child that power without accountability is just weakness with better clothes. Before Dante could answer, his phone buzzed. Then Isabella S. Then Gabriel opened the back door, his face dark. Bella, he said, you need to see this. The video had already spread across every major gossip account in Chicago. Grainy footage from the crash. Edited, cropped, manipulated. Showed Isabella S. SUV swerving near Valeria S. car, but cut away before the truck entered the intersection. The caption was already everywhere. Pregnant mafia wife under investigation after crash involving husband S. lover. Isabella watched it once. Dante watched her. He expected tears, maybe rage. But Isabella only placed one hand over her belly and looked at the screen with cold understanding. Someone had tried to take her child. Now they were trying to take her name. By sunrise, Isabella S. name was everywhere. Not her real name, not the name her mother had whispered when she was a child, not the name Gabriel used when he was trying not to cry. Online, she became something smaller and uglier. Jealous mafia wife, the pregnant woman who lost control, the wife who couldn't handle being replaced. Every headline took a piece of her and twisted it until even she barely recognized herself. The edited video played again and again across gossip pages, local news clips, and anonymous accounts that had never cared about truth in their lives. In the footage, Isabella S. SUV seemed to swerve near Valeria S. car. The truck was missing. The timing was wrong. The angle was cropped. But lies did not need to be complete. They only needed to be repeated before the truth could catch its breath. Isabella sat on the edge of the bed in the safe house with her phone turned face down beside her. Curtains were half open, letting in a gray morning light that made the room look colder than it was. Outside, Gabriel had doubled the private security without asking her. Inside, Patricia Wells was already on the phone with someone from a digital forensics firm. Dr. Evelyn Hart had called twice before 8 o'clock to remind Isabella to check her blood pressure, drink water, and avoid unnecessary stress, as if stress were a stranger who could be denied at the door. But the world had found her anyway. For a long time, Isabella did not cry. She simply sat with one hand on her belly and listened to the quiet movements of the house around her. A guard's footsteps on the porch. Gabriel L.'s low voice in the kitchen. Patricia S.'s sharp tone through the wall. The faint hum of the refrigerator. Small, ordinary sounds of a life that was trying to continue while strangers debated whether she was a victim or a villain. Then the baby moved. Not strongly. Just enough. Isabella lowered her head and breathed out through her mouth. Slowly, the way Evelyn had taught her. There you are, she whispered. I was waiting for you. The words broke something open. Her eyes filled, but she wiped the tears away before they fell, not because tears were weak. She no longer believed that. Tears were human. Tears were proof something still mattered. She knew the difference between grieving and drowning, and she refused to drown while someone else held her head underwater and called it news. Gabriel knocked once before entering. He carried a mug of tea he had probably forgotten to sweeten. You don't have to look at any of it, he said. I know. Then Dante. She looked up at him. If I don't know what they were saying, I don't know what I am fighting. His face tightened. Bella, you were almost killed. Your baby was almost killed. You don't have to fight the entire city before breakfast. A tired smile touched her mouth. That's the problem with men like you and Dante. You think fighting means going to war. Sometimes fighting means staying calm long enough to be believed. Gabriel had no answer for that. He set the tea on the nightstand and sat beside her. For a few seconds, he was not the head of what remained of the Romano family. He was just her older brother, looking at the bruise on her temple and trying not to remember her as a little girl with scraped knees and ribbons in her hair. I can get you out today, he said quietly. A house in Vermont, no press. No Moridi men, no Luca, no Dante. And then what? Isabella asked. I wait there while they turn me into a story I can correct. You survive. She placed her palm over her stomach. So does a buried woman. That does to make it a life. Before Gabriel could respond, Evelyn arrived with a medical bag and the expression of a woman who had not slept enough to be patient with foolishness. Checked Isabella's blood pressure, asked about pain, movement, dizziness, and contractions, then looked at the phone lying face down on the bed. How much have you seen enough? Evelyn gave her a long look. Your body does not know the difference between an enemy with a gun and an enemy with a headline. Stress is stress. Blood pressure is blood pressure. If this keeps up, your risk goes up with it. Isabella closed her eyes briefly. So I should stay silent? No, Evelyn said. You should stop letting them decide the rhythm. Don't fight louder. Fight clearer. That sentence stayed in the room. Fight clearer. By noon, Isabella had made her decision. Patricia did not like it at first. Gabriel hated it. Evelyn warned her to keep it short, but no one stopped her, because something had changed since the crash. Isabella no longer asked permission to stand inside her own life. They recorded the video in the living room of the safe house. No makeup artist, no dramatic lighting, no expensive jewelry. Isabella wore a soft cream sweater and sat in an armchair near the window. Her face was pale, the bruise at her temple still visible. She did not hide it. She wanted people to see what the edited video had cut away. When Patricia asked if she was ready, Isabella placed both hands on her belly and nodded. The camera began recording. My name is Isabella Romano Moretti, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. Last night, I was injured in a crash that also endangered my unborn child. I am cooperating with the investigation. The footage being shared online is incomplete and misleading. I did not cause that accident. She paused, not because she forgot what to say, but because she wanted every word to land cleanly. I understand that people are curious. I understand that my husband's name makes this story louder. But my child is not a headline. Pregnancy is not public property, and my pain is not entertainment. Behind the camera, Gabriel looked down. Isabella continued. A betrayed woman is not automatically unstable. A pregnant woman is not automatically manipulative. And a mother protecting her child should never have to apologize for surviving. The room went very still. I will not discuss my marriage today. I will not answer questions designed to humiliate me or any other woman involved. I will only say this, the truth will come out. And when it does, I hope people remember how easily they were willing to blame the woman who was bleeding. Patricia ended the recording. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Evelyn nodded once. Good. The video was posted through Patricia's office less than an hour later. First, the comments were cruel, as expected. Then something shifted. Women began responding. Older women, younger women, mothers, divorced wives, nurses, survivors, women who had been called crazy when they were only hurt, women who had been blamed for the affairs they discovered, women who had been told to stay quiet for the sake of family, reputation, children, money, God, tradition, anything but themselves. Evening, Isabella's line had spread across thousands of posts. A pregnant woman is not public property. Daunt saw the video from his office at the Morty estate. He watched it once standing up, then again sitting down. Then a third time with one hand covering his mouth, as if silence could hold back the shame rising in him. She had not said his name. She did not have to. Every word was built from the wreckage he had left her in. Marco stood near the door. She's stronger than all of us. Daunt did not argue. She always was, he said. Marco's phone buzzed before Dantes did. He read the message, and his expression changed. The forensics team traced one of the accounts that pushed the edited video first. It links back to a media consultant, Luca, used last year. Dante looked up slowly. Marco continued, and Holloway Transport received payment from a shell company 3 days before the crash. Same shell company, Luxa's Circle. Before Dante could speak, his phone rang. Unknown number, he answered. For a moment there was only breathing. Then Valeria's voice came through. Thin and terrified. Dante? His body went still. Where are you? Can't he talk to you? He'll know who. But Valeria was no longer speaking to him. Another sound came through the line. A muffled sob, then a whisper, not meant for Dan, or perhaps meant for the only woman who might understand. Isabella, Valeria said, please. He didn't plan the crash to kill me. Dante's blood turned cold. Valeria's voice broke. He planned it to kill your baby. Dante did not move for several seconds after Valeria's words came through the phone. The room around him seemed to lose shape. The desk, the windows, the city beyond the glass, even Marco standing near the door, everything became distant except for one sentence. Planned it to kill your baby. Not Isabella, not Valeria, not him, the baby, his child. The child Isabella had begged him to save while he ran in the wrong direction. "Where are you?" Dante asked, his voice so low it barely sounded human. Valeria was crying now, trying to speak and breathe at the same time. "I can tell you. If Luca knows I called." The line went dead. Dante stared at the phone. One dark second, every old instinct in him came alive. He saw Luca's face. He saw blood on a floor. He saw men moving quietly at midnight, a car disappearing under a bridge. A family problem solved the way Moretti men had solved problems for 3 generations. It would be easy, too easy, one order, and Luca would never threaten Isabella again. Marco saw that thought cross Dante's face. "No," the old man said. Dante looked up slowly. "You don't know what he did." "I know exactly what he did," Marco answered, "and I know what you want to do. If you answer this with blood, Isabella will learn only one thing, that her daughter is still trapped inside the same world that nearly killed her." The word daughter landed, though no one knew yet if the baby was a girl. Maybe Marco said it because Isabella had once told him she hoped for one. Maybe because the child had become real to him, in a way Dante was only beginning to understand. Dante turned toward the window. Below, Chicago moved like nothing had changed. Cars crossed bridges. People walked beneath umbrellas. Somewhere in that city, Isabella was lying in a safe house with his child inside her. And for the first time in his life, Dante understood that protection was not the same as possession. "What do we have?" he asked. Marco exhaled. It was not forgiveness, but it was relief. Not enough. "Need phone records, banking records, proof of the shell company, the original traffic footage, and Valeria alive long enough to testify. Find her. I will. But not with soldiers kicking doors in." Dante's jaw tightened. "Then how?" "Like people who want the truth to survive court." The word court would have sounded ridiculous in his father's house. But Dante did not laugh. He picked up his coat and left without another word. He went to the safe house before sunset. This time, he did not arrive with a convoy. Only Marco drove him. Gabriel opened the door and looked as though he might slam it in Dante's face just for the satisfaction. But Isabella appeared behind him before he could. She looked pale, tired, smaller than she should have, yet her eyes were clear. "Luca planned the crash," Dante said. "I know." Those 2 words cut deeper than blame. Dante had come carrying a terrible truth, and she had already reached it without him. She had been protecting herself because she no longer trusted him to protect her. "I'm building a case," he said. "A real one. No family court, no backroom, no disappearing witnesses." Isabella studied him. "That must hurt." "It does." "Good," she said softly. "That means it is finally costing you something." He lowered his eyes. "Bella." She flinched at the old name, and he stopped. For a moment his gaze dropped to her belly. The child moved beneath her sweater, a small shift under her hand. Dante took half a step forward before he could stop himself. "Can I?" "No." The word was quiet, final. He froze. Isabella took one clear step back. "You don't get to touch the place you abandoned." Dante looked like she had struck him. Maybe she had. Maybe truth was the only weapon she had left that could still reach him. "Understand," he said. "No," Isabella answered. "You re-beginning to that night, Valeria was found in a church basement on the south side, hidden by a frightened cousin who owed her more kindness than sense. She was shaking when Isabella arrived with Patricia, Wells, and 2 security men Gabriel trusted. Dante stayed outside because Isabella had asked him to. That alone told Valeria the world had changed. Valeria confessed through tears. The baby was Luca S. The affair with Dante had been part vanity, part fear, part plan. Luca had promised her protection, money, a future. He had told her Isabella's child was the only thing standing between them and power. "Why would you help me?" Valeria whispered. Isabella looked at the woman who had helped break her marriage, then down at the slight curve of Valeria's own pregnancy. "Because my child will not learn mercy from a mother who only knows revenge." Before dawn, Isabella doubled over in sudden pain. Gabriel shouted for help. Evelyn was called. An ambulance came fast. When Dante arrived at the hospital, he stopped before the maternity doors and did not force his way in. Evelyn stepped out, tired and grim. Don swallowed every demand in his throat and asked the first right question of his life. "What does she need from me?" Evelyn held his gaze. "She needs you to stay out unless she asks for you." The maternity ward did not care that Dante Moretti was feared in Chicago. It did not care that men crossed streets to avoid his eyes, that politicians answered his calls, that old enemies still lowered their voices when they said his name. In that hallway, beneath the pale lights and the smell of disinfectant, Dante was only a man standing outside a door while his wife and unborn child fought for their lives on the other side. Bella had been taken in too quickly for him to see her. One minute she was being wheeled through the doors, pale and shaking, Gabriel walking beside the stretcher with his hand over hers. The next minute the doors swung shut, and Dante was left behind with nothing but the sound of hurried footsteps and medical voices he could not command. Dr. Evelyn Hart moved with quiet authority. Nurses came and went, a monitor alarmed somewhere behind the wall. Dante heard the words premature labor, fetal distress, blood pressure, and prepare neonatal. None of them belonged to his world. He knew how to read a threat in a man's posture. He knew when a smile meant betrayal. He knew how to make a room go silent with one look. He did not know how to make his daughter wait longer inside her manverquenda room. No one had confirmed the baby was a girl. Still, in his mind, she was. Maybe because Marco had said daughter. Maybe because Isabella had once stood in the nursery, running her fingers over a soft, yellow blanket, and said she hoped their child would be brave enough to never confuse fear with respect. Dante sat down because his legs suddenly felt unfamiliar. Marco stood beside him silent. For once the old man had no words sharp enough to help. Inside the delivery room, Isabella gripped Gabriel's hand so hard his knuckles turned white. Pain rolled through her in waves, each one stealing her breath, before giving it back thinner than before. Evelyn leaned over her, calm and firm, telling her when to breathe, when to push, when to hold on. "I can Isabella whispered once. Gabriel bent close. "Yes, you can." She shook her head, tears sliding into her hair. "I'm scared, I know," he said, "but you are not alone." For one brief, terrible second, Isabella thought of Dante, not the man in the hallway. Not the man who had carried Valeria through the rain. The other one. The man who had once placed his palm on her stomach and gone completely still when the baby kicked for the first time. He had smiled then, almost boyish, almost innocent, as if fatherhood had reached some hidden place in him that violence had not ruined yet. Then she remembered the crash, the glass, the rain. Back as he ran away, she closed her eyes and let that memory harden into strength. The baby came too early, too small, and without a cry at first, that silence stopped the room. Isabella turned her head, trying to see. Why isn't she crying? No one answered fast enough. A team rushed the baby to the warming table. Evelyn stayed with Isabella, but kept looking toward the neonatal staff. Gabriel's face went gray. Isabella began saying no over and over. Softly at first, then louder, as if the word could pull life back into the room. Then finally, a sound came, tiny, angry, alive. Isabella broke, not loudly. She simply covered her mouth with one shaking hand as the first real sob tore through her. Evelyn leaned close and said, "She is here." "She is early, but she is here." Outside, Dant heard the cry through the door. He stood. No one had to tell him. Something in his body knew. His child had entered the world fighting. Evelyn finally came out. Her eyes were tired, but not hopeless. "It is a girl," she said. "She is premature Shiniku, but she is alive." Dante closed his eyes. For the first time since the crash, he looked less like a boss than a hound man who had been spared a punishment he knew he deserved. "What's her name?" he asked. Evelyn looked to the room behind her. Isabella named her hope Lucia Mortiromano. Lucia, his mother's name. The name struck him so hard he had to place one hand against the wall. His mother had died because the men around her had chosen power first. Now Isabella had given that name to the daughter he had almost failed the same way. A little later, Daunt was allowed to see Hope through the Niku glass. She was impossibly small, wrapped beneath wires and soft light, her tiny chest rising and falling with effort. Daunt lifted one hand to the glass but did not touch it at first, as if even that might be too much. Marco came to stand beside him. "This," Marco said quietly, "is what your pride almost cost." Daunt did not answer. He could not. Behind them, Isabella was wheeled past on her bed. She looked exhausted, pale, emptied by pain and strength. Daunt turned toward her, but he did not step into her path. She looked at him once. Not with forgiveness. With hatred, with the clear eyes of a mother who had survived without him. Then a nurse entered the NICU and froze. On the edge of Hope's blanket lay a small silver emblem, the Moretti crest, cut cleanly in half. Marco reached for it first, his face darkening. Dante stared at the broken crest in his palm and understood the message. Choose the child, and the family burns. Slowly, he looked back at Isabella. This time he did not look away. I will not choose wrong again, he whispered. By dawn, Dante Moretti had called the family council together. Men arrived at the estate in dark coats and darker moods, stepping out of black cars beneath a sky that looked as heavy as judgment. Some came because they were loyal. Some came because they were afraid. A few came because they wanted to see if the great Dante Moretti had finally become weak enough to challenge. They gathered in the old dining room where 3 generations of Moretti men had settled, approved marriages, divided territory, and buried sins beneath polished wood and expensive wine. This morning there was no wine. There was only coffee, silence, and the broken silver crest dant placed in the center of the table. Luca arrived last. He looked tired, but not frightened. That was the first thing Marco noticed. A guilty man might hide. A desperate man might run. But Luca entered like a man who had already rehearsed this scene in his head and believed he knew how it would end. He kissed one older uncle on the cheek, nodded to 2 capos, then looked at Dante with soft concern. I heard about the baby, Luca said. Thank God she survived. Dante did not answer. Luca glanced at the broken crest on the table. Whoever did that should be dealt with quietly. The family does not need more attention. Quietly, Dante repeated. That is how we survive. For a moment, no one spoke. The old men watched Dante carefully. They expected rage. They expected blood. They expected him to point at Luca, give an order, and let the house swallow the truth the way it had swallowed so many truths before. Instead, Dante stood. Failed my wife, he said. The room went still. Luca's expression changed for only half a second. It was quick, but Marco saw it. Surprise, not fear yet, just surprise. Dante continued, his voice steady. The night of the crash, Isabella called for me. She called for our child. I heard her. I saw her. I chose wrong. An older man shifted uncomfortably. Dante, this is not, it is exactly the time, Dantain said. Because the same weakness that made me choose wrong gave one of you room to move against my wife and my daughter. The word daughter changed the air. Hope was no longer an unborn possibility. She had a name now, a heartbeat, a place in the world. Marco stepped forward and placed a folder beside the broken crest. Then another, then another. Phone records, he said. Bank transfers. Traffic camera logs. Messages between Luca's people and Holloway Transport. Payment records through 3 shell companies, the first account that pushed the edited crash video, all connected to Luca. Luca laughed once, lightly. This is embarrassing. You letting a woman and a premature baby make you see ghosts. Dante looked at him, and for the first time since the crash, there was no confusion in his eyes. No, he said. I was weak when I thought women and children could wait while men settled power. Luca's smile faded. One of the capos leaned forward. What are you asking us to do? Nothing, Dante said. That is the point. He picked up the top folder and handed it to Patricia Wells, who had been standing silently near the doorway with 2 federal investigators no one had expected to see inside the Morty estate. A shocked murmur moved around the table. Luca stepped back. You brought law into this house? I brought consequences, Dante said. You will expose us all if that is what it costs to keep my daughter from inheriting this sickness, then yes. For a second, Luca's mask fully broke. Hatred burned through his face. You'll lose everything for a wife who may never come back to you. Dante took one step closer. The room held its breath. I am not doing this so Isabella comes back, he said. I am doing it, because that night she called me the father of her child, and I was not worthy of the title. No one moved when the investigators took Luca. Not even the men who once would have killed for him. Power depended on certainty, and Luca had lost his. As he was led past Dante, Luca leaned close and whispered, Your father would be ashamed of you. Dante looked at him calmly. Father taught me how to be feared, he said. My daughter will teach me how to be better. By evening, the news had begun to spread. Luca Moretti arrested. Federal cooperation confirmed. Moretti businesses under review. The empire trembled. At the hospital, Isabella heard it from Gabriel. She sat beside Hope's incubator, one hand resting gently against the glass. Dante turned him in, Gabriel said. Isabella did not smile. She did not soften. She only looked at her tiny daughter, fighting beneath the warm hospital light. She whispered. Now let's see if he can keep choosing right when no one is watching. The city began to change its story before Isabella changed her heart. By the next morning, the same news anchors who had called her unstable were speaking more carefully. The same gossip pages that had replayed the edited crash footage now used words like alleged manipulation, federal inquiry, and Luca Moretti's arrest. People who had blamed her quietly deleted comments. Others wrote apologies they hoped would be seen, but none of it reached the place inside Isabella where the damage had settled. Public opinion could turn in a day. Trauma did not. Hope remained in the NICU, small and stubborn, beneath the warm hospital lights. Isabella spent most of her hours beside the incubator, learning a new language made of numbers and alarms, oxygen levels, schedules, weight gain measured in ounces, skin-to-skin contact, hand hygiene. The nurses taught her how to touch her daughter without startling her. How to hold still when every part of her wanted to gather the baby into her arms and run from every man, every headline, every family name that had brought them here. Dante came every day. At first, Isabella hated that she noticed. He did not enter unless allowed. He did not bring flowers. He did not arrive with guards crowding the hallway. He came alone or with Marco, signed in like everyone else, washed his hands for the full time the nurses required, and stood where he was told to stand. If Isabella said nothing, he said nothing. She asked him to leave, he left. The first time she did that, she expected anger. Instead, he nodded once and returned the next morning. That was harder to dismiss than an apology. One night, Isabella found him asleep in a chair outside the NICU. His suit jacket was folded over one arm, his shirt sleeves were rolled up. On his lap was a notebook, filled with careful handwriting. Hopeless weight, her feeding times, questions for Dr. Hart, reminders about premature infant care. Dante Moretti, the man who once had other people remember everything for him, had written down how many milliliters his daughter had taken from a feeding tube. Isabella stood there for a long time. She did not forgive him. She saw him. Across town, Valeria gave birth to a boy under federal protection. The DNA results came 3 days later. Luca was the father, not Dante. Not even close, Patricia told Isabella in a quiet voice, as if the truth might hurt less if delivered gently. Isabella felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Another child had been born into the wreckage. Adults created. She wrote Valeria one short note. Do not raise him to pay for his father's sins. Did not sign it as a friend. She was not that, but she signed it as a mother. Dante's world kept shrinking. Accounts were frozen. Businesses were reviewed. Men who had kissed his ring stopped answering calls. Some called him weak. Some called him finished. Marco, standing beside him in a half-empty office, said, Maybe you lost an empire. But for the first time, you might have a chance to keep a family. Dante looked at the hospital bracelet still around his wrist from his last visit. Only if she lets me know, Marco said. Only if you become the kind of man she doesn't have to fear letting close. That evening, Dante found Isabella in the hospital chapel. She sat in the back pew, too tired to pray, too desperate not to sit somewhere quiet. What do I have to do for you to forgive me? He asked. Isabella did not look at him right away. When she did, her eyes were calm but empty in a way that scared him. That is the problem, Dante, she said. You still think forgiveness is something you can earn on a timeline. I need you to become safe, whether I come back or not. The words hurt because they were fair. Later that week, Hope was stable enough to be held outside the incubator for a few minutes. Isabella held her first, skin to skin, tears sliding silently down her face. Dante watched from the doorway. After a long moment, Isabella looked at him and nodded. He entered slowly, washed his hands, and sat beside her. You may touch her hand, Isabella whispered. Nothing more. Dante reached out one finger. Hope's tiny hand closed around it. And the man once feared by all of Chicago was afraid to breathe too loudly. 6 months later, Chicago no longer whispered Dante. Morita's name the same was. Some still feared him. Some still hated him. Some called him weak because Luca was awaiting trial instead of lying in an unmarked grave. Several Morty businesses were under federal review, old allies had disappeared, and men who once begged for Dante's favor now waited to see if his empire would survive the season. But Dante had stopped measuring his life by how many men lowered their eyes when he entered a room. The night of the crash had taught him something no war ever had. It could protect a throne, it could not protect a family. Isabella did not return to the Morty estate that mattered. People expected her to once Luca was arrested and Valeria was gone. They expected the wife to come home, the scandal to fade, the baby to soften everything, and the family portrait to be repaired with enough monies and silence. But Isabella had learned the price of silence. She lived in a small house with pale curtains, a warm kitchen, and no guards inside the rooms where Hope slept. It was not grand, it was not protected by iron gates, but every corner of it belonged to her. Dante visited by schedule. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sunday afternoons. He arrived on time, never early enough to pressure her, never late enough to disappoint Hope. Though Hope was still too young to understand time, he no longer brought diamonds, flowers, or gifts that looked like apologies wrapped in velvet. He brought diapers when Isabella asked, clean blankets, sometimes coffee for Gabriel, though Gabriel rarely thanked him. Dante accepted that too. Hope had grown stronger, still small, still watched carefully by doctors, but bright-eyed and stubborn in a way that made Evelyn Hart laugh and say, "That child came into this world fighting and never stopped." Dante learned how to hold her head, how to warm a bottle, how to fold tiny clothes with hands that had once signed orders men killed for. He learned that babies did not care about power. They cared about warmth, steadiness, and whether the person holding them stayed calm when they cried. One rainy evening, Hope would not settle. Isabella had been awake since before dawn, and exhaustion showed in the slope of her shoulders. Dante stood near the nursery door, careful not to cross too close without permission. "Can I try?" he asked softly. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. Then she handed him their daughter. Dante took Hope, as if someone had placed his soul in his arms. He held her against his chest, slow and careful, whispering her name until her crying softened into small, tired breaths. Isabella watched them from the rocking chair. The pain did not leave her. A man holding a baby could not erase broken glass, it could not erase rain, it could not erase the sight of his back as he ran toward another woman, but it was something not enough, but something I still. "Roots of the rain," Isabella said. Dante closed his eyes. "So do I will remember it for the rest of my life. I don't know if I can love you the way I did before." He looked at Hope. First, then at her. "Then Dante, love yourself first. Love her. If one day there is anything left for me, I'll be grateful. If not, I'll still show up." Weeks later, Isabella stood on a small stage at a fundraiser for mothers of premature babies. She had built the foundation with money that no longer carried the Moretti name. Women filled the room. Nurses, mothers, survivors. Dante stood near the back, holding Hope, silent and still. Isabella looked out at the crowd and said, "No child should be born into a house where power is louder than love." Dante did not applaud first. He did not step forward. He did not make her strength part of his redemption. He simply stood there and respected the woman he had once expected to wait for him. After the event, rain began to fall. Dante walked Isabella and Hope to the car, not ahead of them, not behind them, but beside them. Isabella looked up at the rain. "Last time it rained, you ran the wrong way." Dante nodded. I know. She let him hold Hope for one more moment. "Then keep walking the right way," she said. And Dante Moretti, once the most feared man in Chicago, walked beside his family like a man who finally understood that love was not something he owned. It was something he had to earn, one right choice at a time. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
This story is not simply about a mafia boss, a betrayed wife, or a mistress. At its heart, this is a story about choices, the kind of choices that reveal who we truly are when there is no time to pretend. Dante Moretti had power, money, influence, and men willing to obey him. But on the night of the crash, none of that mattered. His pregnant wife was trapped, bleeding, and crying for help. His unborn child was in danger, and in that one moment, Dante chose wrong. That choice became more powerful than every title he had ever held. The lesson is clear. Real power is not control. Real power is responsibility. Many people mistake protection for possession. They believe that because they provide money, status, or security, they have done enough. But love is not proven by what we give when life is easy. Love is proven by who we choose when everything falls apart. Isabella's journey teaches us another important lesson. Strength does not always look like revenge. Sometimes strength is quiet. It is setting boundaries. It is refusing to beg. It is protecting your child, your dignity, and your peace, even when the world tries to shame you. She does not win by becoming cruel. She wins by becoming clear. Dante's redemption is also meaningful because he does not receive forgiveness easily. He has to learn that an apology is not enough. Tears are not enough. Regret is not enough. A person who causes pain must become safe again through action, patience, humility, and consistency. The story also reminds us that children should not inherit the sins of adults. Hope's birth represents a chance to break the cycle, a chance for one generation to stop passing down pride, violence, betrayal, and silence. In the end, this story teaches that love without safety is not love. Power without accountability is weakness. And the strongest people are not those who never make mistakes, but those brave enough to face the truth, change their behavior, and protect others without demanding reward.